Hello everybody, and welcome to a little mini-series that I'm going to be starting. It's no surprise that some of the weapons in this game are really freaking bad. Whether it's because they have a terrible gimmick, they have a single stat holding them back, or they're just plain outclassed by every other available option, there are certain weapons for almost every single class that you're never going to use if you're actually trying to win. So in this series, I'm going through the bad weapons that each class has to offer, explaining what's wrong with them, and proposing new stats that I think would suit the weapon better. Brief disclaimer that without gameplay testing, it is hard for me to know whether something is 100% balanced. If you think that the changes that I make to a weapon are overpowered or underpowered, please let me know in the comments and I'll do my best to respond, or if I get enough, I may even make a future video addressing them all. Anyway, let's examine Scout's arsenal. Scout's primaries are actually all pretty solid, with the exception of the Babyface's blaster, that is. What was once the weapon of choice for Lime Pub Scouts everywhere was nerfed into absolute oblivion a few years ago. As of currently, the main problem with the Babyface's blaster is that the boost effect drains way too quickly to be of any reasonable use. Currently, you can lose boost by double jumping or taking damage. While this all sounds okay, it only takes a measly 25 damage to completely drain the meter. While we could just decrease the amount of boost lost upon taking damage, I think a better solution is actually to rework the boost system entirely. My suggested stats are these. Essentially, we keep the way to gain boost exactly the same, but we require the Scout to constantly be dealing damage to maintain it. This way, the Scout starts each fight at minimum boost, but if he's able to secure the kill, he's able to then chain kills with a maximum boost meter, similar to how the Big Earner works. In addition, having boost does not increase your airspeed under these new stats, meaning that Scouts can't just mash the spacebar to avoid taking damage completely, which was what was wrong with the old design. Looking at Scout's secondaries, there are two weapons whose stats don't make a lot of sense to me. The Winger and the Pretty Boy's pocket pistol each feel incomplete almost. It's hard to describe, but the stats that they currently have just don't really seem to synergize well with anything, and they're both outclassed by the stock pistol and the other utility secondaries. The reason that I bring these up together, however, is because I think that they can both be fixed if you just swap a few stats around. First of all, we'll take all of the damage-based stats and put them on the pocket pistol. This gives it 15% faster firing speed, 15% more damage, up to 5 health gain per shot, which, we can reduce if that turns out to be too unbalanced, with the drawback of only having 6 shots in a clip instead of 12. Now, we can take all the mobility-based stats and inject them into the Winger. The Winger now grants the player no fall damage and extra jump height while active, with the penalty of 3 fewer rounds per magazine. Oh, and for those of you not aware, the fall damage removal thing used to be a stat on the pocket pistol a few years ago, so that's where I'm pulling that from. I think giving an actual focus to the stats of these weapons would really go a long way into making them good side grades, and would make them a little bit less awkward to equip. With the exception of the Boston Basher and kind of the Fan of War, every single one of Scout's melees are bad, simply because Scout is never going to need to use his melee with anyone practically ever. So with that in mind, I'm going to be taking a mostly utility approach when reworking these weapons. First of all, let's look at the Candy Cane. The Candy Cane is actually not that bad compared to some of the other options on this list, but the main problem with it is that the downside of using it is way too risky in most scenarios. I think the most simple fix with this one is slightly lowering the explosive damage vulnerability from 25% to, say, 20%. This would still pose a risk-reward mechanic for running this weapon, because 20% explosive vulnerability is not negligible by any means, but it would also allow the Scout to not be one-shot by most explosives when he's at max health. Like the Candy Cane, the Atomizer is not too bad where it's at, and some would even argue that it doesn't need to be changed at all, but I still feel that it's a little bit awkward to use at the moment, and its current state would suck if the other changes in this video got implemented. The current problem with it is that the extra mobility that you get takes forever to activate because of the long switch time, and because of that it doesn't really have any combat uses at all. My proposed solution to this is to either remove the switch speed penalty entirely, or just revert it back to its old stats. I get that mashing the spacebar to avoid damage was kind of an issue, but in places that it's going to matter, it's going to be banned, so I'm not too concerned. As far as the Rap Assassin goes, people have pretty mixed opinions on this thing, but the one thing that most people agree upon is that the weapon is not good. The one problem that can be fixed with a simple stat change is that the damage that you're doing with the weapon itself and the ornament both feel abysmal. To change this, I would give it these stats. And like I said, the visible stats of the weapon won't change a whole lot, but that's where the minor changes of the detail would come into play. First, we give the ornament a larger explosion radius, so it's a lot easier to hit multiple enemies with it. Second, instead of the Ornament just inflicting bleed upon the initial hit, it inflicts bleed upon everyone who's hit by the explosion, although we could shorten the bleed time on those enemies if that's too unbalanced. Third, we actually make the Ornament work. Yes, you heard me right, the Ornament is completely and fundamentally broken as it is. It currently explodes in random parts of the air about 50% of the time you launch it, and fixing this itself would go a long way to making the weapon usable again. And finally, how can anyone bring up bad scout weapons without highlighting the holy grail of terribleness of the Sun on a Stick? Although the last update gave the weapon a very niche and very, very tiny use, the Sun on a Stick is considered by a lot of people to be the absolute worst weapon in the game, and it's often the butt of many jokes. The problem with it is that there's not a single reason to use this weapon in any game mode ever, because the main gimmick is not only outclassed by your scattergun, but your stock bat as well. So because it's so terrible, I'm going to provide not one, but two different fixes, so maybe that one day this weapon can have its retribution. The first option would be as follows. Interestingly, the other worst weapon in the game has a gimmick that would really work well on Scout, which is setting things on fire. While this may not make the Sun on the Stick the go-to meta weapon, granting another class the ability to set things ablaze would at least give this weapon a fun and solid niche. Now, my first thought with this, and I'm sure yours as well, is that these stats would make it essentially a better version of the Boston Basher, but I think the lower DPS of the weapon, combined with the minor differences between fire and bleed, would justify picking one over the other in different occasions. But if you still think it would be too similar, I do have another stat line to bring to the table, which is a more utility approach, and it is as follows. Like I mentioned, this is a much more utility-minded approach that would give the Sun on a Stick the niche of fighting pyros. Basically, this rework increases the fire-resistant effects and changes them to on-wearer, which would allow the Scout to actually have an advantage in a firefight against a pyro. If this turns out to be overtuned, the Afterburn immunity stat could just be changed to a simple fire-resistant stat, because I'm pretty sure that does reduce the damage done by Afterburn. Unfortunately, like most of the other classes, Scout falls victim to only having about half of his weapons actually be usable. I know it's unlikely that any of these specific changes will be accepted to the game, but it's still good to conceptualize ways to allow classes to have equal access to their entire arsenal. Once again, I'm willing to hear any disputes that you may have with my suggested stats. I'm not perfect in designing weapons, these are stats that I'm throwing out that I think would be interesting. So if you have any suggestions of your own or problems with mine, leave them in the comments and I will get to them. So until next time, have a good one.